November 1944. A narrow road in eastern France sown with mines. Staff Sergeant Ruben Rivers climbs down from his Sherman fire and walks toward the steel cable blocking the advance. He has been told for almost 2 years that men like him cannot do this job. His battalion will fight for 183 straight days, longer than almost any armored unit in Europe. The first Silver Star will be pinned within a week. The Medal of Honor will take 53 years. To understand why a soldier refuses a stretcher and climbs back into on paper. In 1925, a war college study concluded that black Americans lacked the intelligence and steadiness for modern combat. That document shaped 20 years of policy. So when the Army finally stood up an all-black armored unit in 1942, almost no one at the top expected it to reach a battlefield. In the eyes of many commanders, the 61st Tank Battalion was a unit built to be quietly set aside. The battalion was activated on April 1, 1942, at Camp Clybourne, Louisiana. The men were quartered a mile from the front gate beside the camp sewage plant in tents that rotted in the damp. Training later moved to Camp Hood, Texas, deep in the segregated South, where a black soldier in uniform could still be ordered to the back of a base bus. One of those soldiers was a young lieutenant named Jackie Robinson. He was court-martialed for refusing to move. He was acquitted. He never shipped overseas with the men he trained beside. Their commander was Lieutenant Colonel Paul Bates, a white officer who had asked for the assignment and then refused to let his men be merely adequate. Bates drilled the 761st harder than the units around them because he understood the arithmetic they faced. Average would be called proof of inferior to count. The men took their motto from the heavyweight champion Joe Louis: "Come out fighting." They painted a black panther on their patch, and they waited for a war the Army kept deciding they were not ready for. Sit with the strangeness of that. These were men volunteering and being drafted to fight for a country that made them ride at the back of its buses and drink from separate fountains. Many framed it through what the black press of the day called the WWII victory against fascism abroad and victory against discrimination at home. They believed that if they fought well enough, the nation would finally have to see them clearly. The 761st was about to test that belief under fire, and the test would last the rest of their lives. By the summer of 1944, the war itself overruled the prejudice. The Allied advance across France was losing tank crews faster than the Army could replace them, and the 761st was finally ordered to the front. In October 1944, the Black Panthers landed in France and were handed to one of the most demanding, most feared commanders in the United States Army. If lesser-known history like this is what you came for, subscribe, because what that general said to them is next. The commander was General George Patton, the same Patton who months later would gamble an entire task force on a raid 50 miles behind enemy lines. Patton wanted aggressive armor and did not much care where it came from. When the 761st arrived, he climbed up to look his new tankers over and spoke to them directly. By the accounts of the men who stood there, he told them, quote, "I would never have asked for you if you weren't good. I have nothing but the best in my army." He said other things too, in language far rougher than this channel will repeat. But the message landed. A general had told them they belonged. Among the tank commanders looking up at him was Staff Sergeant Ruben Rivers of Able Company. Rivers was from Tecumseh, Oklahoma, the son of a farminkie, one of more than a dozen children. He had worked the railroad before the draft. Inside the battalion he was known as Steady, the kind of sergeant other men arranged themselves around when things went wrong. Within days of entering combat, that steadiness would make him the first man in the 761st recommended for a Silver Star. Within 2 weeks, it would cost him his life. What happened next was almost left out of the official record. On November 7, 1944, the 761st entered combat for the first time, attached to the 26th Infantry Division in the Lorraine region of France. The fighting was immediate and unrelenting. Towns like Vic taken almost house by house, with the Shermans drawing fire so the infantry could move. The army that had spent 20 years doubting these men now needed them for the hardest work on the field. They did it. On November 8, near Vic-sur-Seille, the company hit a roadblock. A felled tree wrapped in mines closed the only road forward, and German guns covered it. Rivers did not wait for engineers. He climbed out of his tank in the open under fire, fixed a cable to the obstacle, and dragged it clear so the column could advance. For that he was awarded the Silver Star, the first in the battalion's history. It was exactly the kind of act the Army had been told these men did not have in them. Rivers had been in combat for 1 day. 8 days later, on November 16, the 761st assaulted the town of Guebling. Rivers' tank struck a mine, and the blast opened his leg to the bone. The surgeon wanted him evacuated. His company commander, Captain David Williams, ordered him to the rear. Ruled his war was over. Rivers refused. He turned down morphine because he wanted a clear head. took command of another tank and stayed with his men. For 3 more days, he fought on a wound that should have pulled him out of the line, because he had decided that leaving was not something he was willing to do. On the morning of November 19, near Guebling, the company moved into the open and German anti-tank guns opened up from a ridge. Captain Williams gave the order to pull back. Over the radio, Rivers answered that he could see the guns and that he intended to fight them. He put his tank between the enemy and his withdrawing company and opened fire to cover them. It was the choice he had been making for 3 days, made one last time out loud. His Sherman was hit. Staff Sergeant Ruben Rivers was killed instantly. He was in his 20s. The men he shielded got out. The recommendation his captain wrote that day would go unanswered for half a century. Rivers' death did not pause the war for the 761st. Within weeks, the entire Western Front was thrown into crisis. On December 16, 1944, Germany launched its last great offensive in the west through the forests of the Ardennes. The battle Americans would call the Bulge. Patton wheeled his Third Army north toward the surrounded crossroads town of Bastogne, and the 761st went with him. By early January 1945, the Black Panthers were fighting in deep snow against some of the best units Germany had left, for a town few Americans have ever heard of. The town was Tillet in Belgium, about 12 miles west of Bastogne, held by elite German armored troops. The 761st went in with only 11 working tanks. The fight lasted days in cold that thickened the oil in the engines against dug-in armor and infantry. The battalion took Tillet, but of the 11 tanks that started, only a few came out. It was at places like this that the enemy could not square the men in front of them with what they had been told. One captured German officer reportedly asked his interrogators how many Negro tank divisions the Americans had. The answer was 1 understrength battalion. Tillet and the fights around it produced one of the most extraordinary individual stories of the war, in a soldier named Warren Creasy. When Creasy's tank was knocked out, by the accounts of the men around him, he kept fighting on foot and from a second vehicle, exposing himself again and again to silence the positions pinning his comrades. His own men gave him a grim nickname, the baddest man in the 761st. Creasy was recommended for the Medal of Honor. Like Rivers, he did not receive it then. Unlike Rivers, he survived the war and lived to see almost none of the recognition arrive. After the Bulge, the 761st kept driving east. In one of its most important actions, that had punched a hole in the Siegfried Line, the belt of concrete and steel guarding Germany's border, and held it open so the 4th Armored Division could pour through into the Reich. If this is the kind of history the men themselves never scribe. The Black Panthers deep into Germany that forgot. The Black Panthers pushed deep into Germany, far ahead of the doubts that had followed them from Louisiana. In the first days of May 1945, with Germany collapsing, the 761st reached deep into Austria and linked up with the Soviet army near the Enns River. There the tankers came upon something no training had prepared them for. A camp at Gunskirchen, a sub-camp of Mauthausen, holding thousands of prisoners, most of them Hungarian Jews, many near death from starvation. The guards had already fled. The men of the 761st, soldiers who had spent their whole lives being told they were less than fully American, opened the gates. One survivor later wrote a poem about the black soldier who freed her. She titled it The Black Messiah. When the war in Europe ended, the record of the 761st was beyond dispute. The battalion had spent 183 consecutive days in combat, far longer than the few weeks most units endured at the front, and had paid for it with a casualty rate near 50%. They had fought across France, Belgium, Germany, and into Austria, and then the recognition simply did not come. No man of the 761st received the Medal of Honor. In fact, not one black American serviceman received the nation's highest award for valor in all of World War II. For years, almost the only place the full record lived was the battalion's own 1945 history, Come Out Fighting, written by the war correspondent Tresvant Anderson, who had gone into combat with the men. It took 33 years for the Army to formally acknowledge what the battalion had done. In 1978, the 761st Tank Battalion was awarded the Presidential Unit Citation for extraordinary heroism, recognition that reached many of the men only in old age, and others only after they were already gone. But the individual medals, the ones written up on the battlefield and then buried in files, were still unanswered. In the early 1990s, the Army at last commissioned an outside study, run by Shaw University, to ask a hard question. Had black soldiers been denied the Medal of Honor because of their race? The answer was yes. The study identified black soldiers whose documented actions met the standard and who had been passed over. Congress cleared the legal path, and on January 13, 1997, President Bill Clinton presented the Medal of Honor to 7 black American veterans of World War II. Only one was still alive to stand in the room. The other 6 were honored through their families. One of those 6 was Staff Sergeant Ruben Rivers. The recommendation Captain David Williams had written near Guebling in 1944 was finally answered 53 years later. Williams, by then an old man, was there in the White House to watch it happen. Staff Sergeant Ruben Rivers was killed near Guebling, France, on November 19, 1944. He rests there still, in the Lorraine American Cemetery at Saint-Avold, among more than 10,000 Americans who never came home. His name is carried today by a U.S. Army facility in Germany, and remembered on a memorial at Tillet, in the Belgian town his battalion helped take in the snow. He had been told for most of his life that men like him lacked the nerve for this. He answered that not with a speech, but with a tank turned toward the enemy, so that other men could live. The record caught up to him eventually. The truth never needed to. If your father, grandfather, uncle, anyone in your family served in the European theater in any branch, leave their name and one thing about them in the comments. Not just a name. One thing they did, or said, or that you remember. The men who fought with the 761st and the men who fought beside them deserve to be remembered as people. Subscribe if you want the next story. There are more of them.